Hi everyone, it's Yukimi. Thank you for joining me for episode 3 of the Zainichi Music Project podcast. I'm sorry if you hear this noise in the background. It's the radiator at my apartment. It's hissing because today in New York is 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Oh my gosh, it's so cold. That's why the radiator, is actively making joyous noise to make this cold apartment really warm. Anyways, so let's start this episode 3. But before that, in the previous episode, in episode 2, I outlined the historical condition that shaped the Zainichi community. So today, I want to shift from the broader history to something more personal, something many Zainichi Koreans lived with every single day: the experience of having two names. Before I get into my own story, it's important to understand the legal framework behind this. So, after 1952, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty took effect, Koreans in Japan lost the Japanese nationality they had held as imperial subjects. So, as I said to you in the previous episode, overnight we became foreign nationals, right? The Japanese government introduced the alien registration system, which required every Korean resident to carry a registration card with their legal Korean name, nationality status, assigned registration number, and until 2000, mandatory fingerprints. This legal name was the only one recognized by the state. For decades, many of us had a legal Korean name used in official documents, birth records, passports, and the Japanese alias, or we call it tsume in Japanese, used in everyday life, like, for example, school, jobs, bank accounts even, and health insurance too. This wasn't about hiding who we were, but it was a practical response to systems that didn't quite know how to place us and also didn't know how to embrace diversity. So in my family, the legal Korean name existed on paper, but most aspects of daily life happened under the Japanese alias. Growing up, I was Yukimi Noyama. Teachers called me Noyama-san. Childhood friends called me Yukimi-chan. My legal name, Hyun Mi Song, sat quietly in documents I rarely saw. Then everything changed when I entered middle school. Around that time, South Korea was becoming more visible globally, economically, culturally, even hosting the Olympics. Many Zainichi families were rethinking how they presented themselves. Zainichi Koreans were also gaining a more stable legal footing. Permanent residency status became more widely formalized in the 1980s, making a shift from decades of legal precarity. For many, this change brought a small but meaningful sense of dignity after years of being treated as outsiders in the only country they had ever known. South Korea's growing global presence during that period, economically, culturally, and politically, also influenced how some families felt about using their Korean names. For a community that had long struggled with invisibility and stigma, these changes offered a new sense of recognition and self-worth, even if the psychological impact of earlier decades remained. More on this in a later episode. So, my crazy mother, made a decision. From now on, we would use our legal names at school with Korean pronunciation. Oh, that's another story. Anyway, overnight, I went from being Yukimi Noyama to Hyun Mi Song, and I honestly struggled with it. Not because I was ashamed of being Zainichi, but because I was afraid of being treated differently. And in a very homogeneous school environment in Japan, I didn't want to stand out or feel exotic. I mean, without even calling ourselves with Korean names, I felt super exotic anyway, always. So I was proud of my heritage, but I was also a child trying to find a sense of belonging, trying not to stand out too much, you know? No one at that point, friends, teachers, or even my mother, had ever called me Hyun Mi before. Japanese classmates don't usually use first names to call each other, so I became Song-chan. Except Song isn't pronounced as written. It came out more like Son. So I became Son-chan. A name that didn't feel like mine at all. So outside of middle school, I refused to use this new Korean name. It's not new, but I returned to being Yukimi. I was adamant. And since my mother had stopped using Noyama, that was the Japanese last name after her divorce, so I became Yukimi Okawa. Okawa was my mother's maiden name, maiden Japanese alias. Oh my gosh, it's so complicated. For anything outside of school. So I called myself or introduced myself as Yukimi Okawa. Anything outside of school. So, for example, music lessons, part-time work, applications, after-school program, something like that. Oh, I know, this already sounds complicated, right? Are you still with me? Pop quiz. How many versions of my name have I gone through so far? Let's break it down. I was born Hyun Mi Song on paper, but no one ever called me that in daily life. My alias was Yukimi Noyama, that name I used everywhere growing up. Then in middle school, I was suddenly Hyun Mi Song at school. At the same time, outside of middle school, I became Yukimi Okawa. So depending on the setting, I was one of three names. And here is something many people don't realize. Even the Japanese-sounding aliases Zainichi Koreans used were more often made-up surnames. They weren't usually real Japanese family names. Some families adjusted Korean names into similar-sounding Japanese surnames, like Kim for Kimura. Well, Kimura is a very common last name in Japan, I know. But many aliases were slightly unusual or uncommon. So you can sometimes identify Zainichi families by these invented Japanese-sounding last names, like Noyama and Okawa. Fit that pattern, not quite really authentic Japanese surnames. But there's more to say about how these alias names developed historically. Another interesting part of the story that I'll get into it later. Then I moved to the United States for college. Of course, my legal name, Hyun Mi Song, returned because that was the name on my passport. But my college application had a field for preferred name, and without hesitation, I typed Yukimi. Yes, that is the name that has always felt like home, and that is how I became Yukimi Song. Yes, Yukimi Song is a really original American name for me. This may sound complicated, and it is complicated, but it was a common experience for many Zainichi Koreans. Since our birth, it's just complexity after complexity, layers and layers of complexity. Two names meant two identities, depending on context. It wasn't a split in personality, it was a split in recognition and identity too. And this experience is beautifully captured in a poem by the Zainichi Korean poet Chuwol Chong, titled Two Names. In it, he describes the subtle dissonance of living between identities and the quiet bureaucracy that shapes selfhood. Here are the lines. I have always run away to crowds of strangers where sleeves rub against each other, mixing, fighting, gasping for breath. That was Zainichi, resident of Japan. End quote. And later, quote, when I came into this world, my body received two names, my Japanese name, a nom de guerre, and my real name, collateral for Zainichi, printed on a card in a pocketbook with number bestowed and fingerprints dedicated. End quote. What Chuwol captured so clearly is the distance between a name used for living and a name used for remembering. One allowed you to participate, the other held history, lineage, and a version of self that wasn't always permitted in public. Names influenced how we introduced ourselves, how we moved through the world, and what parts of ourselves felt safe to share. They also shaped how others perceived us, sometimes as not fully Japanese, sometimes as not fully Korean, a space shaped by history, not personal choice. Understanding the two-name system helps explain what comes next in the series. Episode 4, Statelessness, what it means to belong nowhere. And Episode 5, Silence, why these stories stayed hidden. And Episode 6, why you have never heard this history before. So that's my plan. Well, thank you for listening and for walking into this history with me. If you'd like to follow the project more closely, you can subscribe on Substack or find the Zainichi Music Project on Instagram or TikTok. More soon.